And we do begin tonight with Michael Antonini, who's been a planning commissioner for 5 years.
Thanks,
You're a
Arthur.
dentist, and you're a dentist.
Yes, I am.
You're able to juggle being a commissioner. How many hours do you put in?
I would say probably 16 hours a week for sure, minimum with commission, because I've got the commission sessions which begin around 1 o'clock and sometimes run till midnight, and then I prepare on Thursday morning, so that's another 4 or 5 hours, and then most of Wednesday is taken up with meetings or preparation. So a couple days a week.
Look, the fact is that what goes down at the Planning Commission results in real construction. I mean, and we're seeing that. We see that especially in South of Market and in the Mission Bay. I mean, it's a phenomenal building boom right now.
Yes, it certainly is. There are like 30,000 units that are in the pipeline as of a report that was released in the first quarter of 2007. And of that 30,000, 25% are under construction and another 28% have been approved.
Okay, but in the meantime, we've seen in the last 4 months a tremendous collapse in the United States housing market, especially new housing. Every city in California has been affected, especially San Diego and Sacramento and Los Angeles. How do you think that impacts all these thousands of units that are either in the pipeline or under construction in San Francisco?
No doubt there'll be some impact. We do have a couple of factors that play into our favor. We're a world-class city. Number two, one of the things that has challenged us over the years is the fact that we have restrictions, we have rent control, we have restrictions on condo conversions, and so some of the avenues that might be possible to create new, particularly ownership housing, are not available. So I think that's one of the factors.
But do you, as a planning commission, when you make your decisions, do you at all consider the market and the quantity that's necessary versus what's absorbed, what's been historically absorbed, and much like in the office area, or do you leave that to the market to decide whether or not they're going to go bankrupt with the project?
I think that's probably a market decision, but from everything we've heard, we have a shortage of housing in San Francisco.
What kind of housing?
Well, at all levels, obviously, because there is still a demand for market rate housing because it continues to sell, and probably better than any place else. We also have a demand for lower income housing, although we've satisfied that to some degree. The place we have the greatest demand that's not being met is middle income housing. That's being for people earning from perhaps collectively $75,000 to about $150,000 per year. A couple.
$150,000, or a single person $70,000 to $80,000.
Well, even a couple $70,000 to $80,000. That's the lower end, and the higher end would probably be somewhere around $140,000. Whatever that level is, above which they could begin to afford the market rate housing, which has to be a fairly high income with today's market.
What percent of that new housing is lower income housing produced by nonprofits?
Well, the Mayor's Office of Housing has reported that over the last 3 years, around 30 to 35% of the housing being built is affordable housing. And of that affordable housing, the vast majority of it is affordable to people at the 80th or percentile or lower, mostly the 60th percentile. So a fairly significant amount is being built for lower income people.
Now, how much would that be in terms of earning an income?
Well, in earning an income, probably for rental housing, this is just the inclusionary rule, but it applies for sake of an argument, probably a couple has to be making $38,000 or less to qualify.
Together?
Together, yeah.
All right, so in other words, what you're saying is there's one group that's earning around $30,000 or $40,000 collectively. That's low income housing.
Right.
The market rate housing is what, probably $200,000?
Well, you could probably find something for less. It depends on what you're looking for, but let's roughly, let's say if you don't have other sources, one would guess you're probably going to have to collectively have $140,000, $150,000 a year.
That mid-range is the one you're talking about.
Right. And we're building nothing for those people.
Building nothing in the mid-range, and once again, that would be how much money earned per year to show to the bank?
Well, probably a mid-range, as we talked about before, would be somewhere between, say, $75,000 to $140,000.
Doesn't that represent a good majority of the workers in San Francisco?
I would think so. I would think, and many of our public safety officials and our teachers and the people that we would like to have as close as possible.
All right. Now we come to the eastern neighborhoods. Now, we had Sue Hester on the program for the full half hour. And I I detected that she was giving up on what's happening at Rincon Hill, what's happening at Mission Bay, which are thousands of units as well. I want to talk about that in a moment, by the way. But it was clear that the eastern neighborhoods is where there's going to be a line in the sand.
Well, I think that's very true, although in Mission Bay there are quite a few projects that are affordable projects too.
Well, okay, then before we go to the eastern neighborhoods, let's take a quick look at Mission Bay, because there's a huge amount of land there. What percent, well, first of all, how many units do you think roughly are going to be there? 6,000, 7,000?
I believe so,
okay.
Yeah.
And what percent would be low income, what percent would be this mid-range we were talking about, and what percent would be market?
Well, at this point, I think, again, the division is pretty much market rate and some lower end units. For example, as you go on King Street up onto 280, those units that are being built right at the end there, those are affordable units. Also the units right across from ATT Park, I believe it's called Rich Soro Place, are affordable units. So they're scattered throughout.
And are those being built by nonprofit developers?
Those are already finished, and I can't say. I would think nonprofits probably built those.
So there's, again, we have a scarcity of this mid-range, but we have the majority of the workers in San Francisco at that range.
Exactly the paradox.
Mm-hmm. And which is why the demographics are changing in the eastern part of San Francisco, correct?
Right.
All right. Now the eastern neighborhoods. Why don't you, now, you're doing a study. You're doing a massive study. Does this include all of the all the environmental impacts that the opposition seeks, including besides traffic, shadow, and so on?
Sure.
Social.
Well, that's what the effort has been made by some to include socioeconomic impacts as an environmental impact. But I should say, with the eastern neighborhoods, the key issues here are basically it's a rezoning. It's a rezoning of previously industrial land, and the two areas of concern are basically what they call PDR, which is industrial uses by another definition, and trying to preserve those, and what part of those should be preserved and what portion of that land should be turned over to mixed use or to housing.
But the opponents, including Sue Hester, when they say housing, they mean something very different than the kind that we were just talking about, this mid-range property. They see it as being the, as I understood from her, the depository for all of the low-income housing.
Right. I think that's pretty clear.
Is she talking about low-income housing, or is she talking also about this mid-range?
Well, I'm not really sure, but she's historically been a proponent for the lower income housing, and I think that there have been statements made by many people that they don't want to see any more market rate housing.
Okay, but how about that mid-range?
Well, you know, that's a good question, and we're going to find out very soon, because a plan is before us from the city, and they have some ideas, and they have some interesting ideas of how to meet this challenge. And this is in the early planning stages, but they're basically going to probably present developers with three choices. One is to build 100% affordable housing. Another is...
I'm going to stop you. Okay. When you say, we're going to have to keep our words defined here. When you say affordable, what do you mean?
We mean that it would be the 120th percentile or lower.
Give us that's that lower end?
Right, pretty much lower end, but theoretically, it could be a little bit higher than what inclusionary housing limits are.
So, someone earning 40 or 50,000?
Yes,
okay.
that could.
All right,
so that's one possibility.
That the developers would be given a green light if they would build that level of housing. Okay,
That's
what's
right.
the second?
Second option is that, let's say, a developer has a pretty good chunk of land. If they give the city half of their land, then they'll be able to build all market rate housing on the other half and not have to do any inclusionary.
And what happens to the other half?
Then the city or whoever will probably
give it to a nonprofit.
Possibly nonprofit, possibly the city itself, to build affordable housing on that area.
Okay.
And the third is one of the most interesting, and that's that you work out a formula whereby the developer would build something like perhaps as much as 60 or 70%. I don't want to, you know, these
sure,
are just...
you're in the middle of negotiations.
Yeah, negotiations, or 50% at the 150th percentile to deal with that middle, up to that level.
Up to that middle level.
Up to that middle level, and then whatever is left, they would build market rate housing. Because of course, every time you build something at a very low end, it costs you $400,000 to $500,000 per unit to build.
I didn't hear in any one of those alternatives a real emphasis on that mid-range, inducing developers to build that mid-range housing.
I think the third one is because if you reach a point where the developer can still make a profit out of the market rate housing that's being built as a percentage of the total thing, then the subsidy they have to put in to build something at the 150th percentile or 140th is much less than if you have to build it at the 80th or 70th percentile. Even for ownership at those lower percentiles, you have to sell them at around 200,000, which means you lose 250,000 per year.
So you think that third alternative would actually induce developers to build both, have the option of building both market rate housing, but also this very needed mid-range housing?
It's an interesting concept that we haven't tried before. We've tried some ballot issues. It didn't work. You know, this might be using the marketplace to try to meet the challenge.
And you would imagine that the opponents of development in the eastern neighborhoods would be hard-pressed to deny that mid-range. I mean, that you're talking about the people work for the city.
It seems to be where
teachers.
Exactly.
So politically, it would be attractive to see a great emphasis on that mid-range housing.
Well, I think it's something the city has sadly lacked. You know, 50% of our workforce commutes into San Francisco. And many of these people would probably like to live in San Francisco if they could afford to. There are obviously other factors.
And the fact is, this same planning commission created the high-rises that forced people to the neighborhoods because there was no housing. It was not attractive in the marketplace for developers to build housing. So they built the office buildings, but didn't worry about the housing. Let the commuters decide how to live.
Right, you're talking back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was, you know, long before my time there, but there was a big boom in the downtown. And I think the theory there was you built the BART system and they would allow for the suburbanization of the housing part of it. And what we realized is the sprawl and the pollution that are being caused by this suburbanization and people commuting many miles to get to work doesn't make a lot of sense.
How do the political forces line up then? In other words, you have a planning commission, you have politics at the planning commission, then it goes to the board. Obviously, this is going to go to the board. It's a huge, this represents 1/5 of San Francisco?
That's probably could be as large as that depending on how you define where the eastern neighborhoods begin and end.
Right, but generally it does include everything probably from King Street all the way to the border with South San Francisco.
It does. For purposes of our present discussion, we have excluded certain parts of that, and we're narrowing it down to some degree. It's still a very large area.
We only have a minute left, but I wanted to, is there any hope for the kind of housing that's being built down right now at the Candlestick Point area or by Lennar and the city in Hunters Point? Will they provide some of this mid-range housing?
Well, that could be a possibility, but I think there's a lot of possibilities here because I think that there's an intent from all parties to get something done.
I want to ask you this one question. Who's the deal maker in San Francisco? There's always someone in a major city that makes the deal. Used to be Willie Brown types or whatever. Who's the deal maker here?
You know, that's a very good question, and I think one of the problems we've had is there isn't one at the present time.
Okay.
Or if there is, it's somewhat hard to find out who that may be.
Still, things are getting done. I wish you the best. Obviously, you're going to have a lot ahead. Mike Antonini, thanks for being with us.
I'm optimistic. Thanks, Arthur.
Okay. Stay with us. We'll be right back.